Good morning, friends. Welcome to another Field Trip Friday. My name's Steve.
And I'm David.
Thank you, David, for hosting with me today. This is awesome.
Yeah, thank you. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. So kind of just a brief kind of intro about today. So we're visiting the Glennstone Nature Preserve with the Ellerbe Creek Watershed Association. So welcome everyone from there. And so I'd also like to introduce our STEM practitioners for today. Thank you so much, Robert, for being here with us from Ellerbe Creek Watershed Association.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Really appreciate having you.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so yeah, and each week we are hosted by different Durham Public Schools classroom, and maybe one day you'll be a host for our next field trip. And I want to give a shout out to this week's host, which is Stephanie here at the museum, as well as our Museum of Life and Science summer camp. So hi, everyone.
Hey, campers. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Cool. So while we're watching this video, which we'll start in just a minute, I just want to remind you, campers, you are welcome to be curious and think about all the questions you have. After we watch this, we're going to ask some of those questions to Robert and have a discussion about what you saw and what you're wondering about, and maybe some of the ideas or thoughts you have about what you saw. So keep those minds open and curious, and we'll watch this video and we'll talk about your questions afterwards. So I hope you enjoyed. This was a super beautiful trip. The Glennstone Nature Preserve is awesome. I'm going to get this screen share going. Good morning, friends. Welcome to another Field Trip Friday. My name's Steve.
And I'm Tanika.
Where are we going today, Tanika?
So today we are inside the Glennstone neighborhood, and we'll be visiting the Glennstone Preserve.
That's awesome. I'm super excited to see this nature preserve right here in a Durham neighborhood. Let's do it.
All right, let's go.
Good morning, Ricky. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do and where we are?
Sure. So I'm Ricky White. I'm the director of the Ellerbe Creek Watershed Association, which is based here in Durham. And for those of you who don't know Ellerbe Creek Watershed Association, first of all, we tend to call it ECWA, so you're probably going to hear that name a lot.
Yeah.
ECWA, that's just the acronym, ECWA. And we do really three things. We do a lot of land protection in Durham, which means that we're buying land that's important for wildlife habitat and water quality to conserve it. The second thing we do is restoration, both of land, ecosystems, and water quality. So we do projects all across the city, but specifically in Ellerbe Creek Watershed around things like removing invasive species, invasive plant species, which actually hurt the ecosystem, and doing projects to improve water quality, like creating what are called bioretention ponds, and creating these other projects like cisterns and rain gardens in people's yards to try to improve the water quality in the area. And then the third thing that we do is engagement. So we're really all about trying to make sure that we include everyone in the watershed in the work that we do. So we don't just work in one neighborhood, we try to work in all the neighborhoods, and we try to listen to the community and understand, hey, what are your needs and where do they kind of match up with the environment? And then we kind of work together to try to implement things in a way that kind of works for everybody. So that's kind of ECWA.
Yeah, no, that's super
nice.
cool. And
Yeah.
it's been really cool speaking with you and working with you over the years, because the Ellerbe Creek runs right through the land that the museum is on.
That's
and
right.
So it's near and dear to our hearts, and this watershed, of course, is near and dear to all of Durham. And it's just really cool to connect with you today.
Yeah, and as a landowner, whether you be like an individual landowner in the city, or a renter, or a museum that owns a bunch of acres, controls a bunch of acres, you're all part of being stewards of the land, because all that water that goes onto your property ends up running off into the creek and ends up either creating a healthy ecosystem and healthy aquatic ecosystem, or something that's not so good if the runoff is polluted. So everyone's working together to try to make this a better place.
Absolutely. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Glennstone Preserve?
Sure. So Glennstone Preserve is actually out, if you can imagine, towards Falls Lake. So Ellerbe Creek starts kind of in North Durham and downtown, and it flows through these urban areas into the suburbs, which is where we're at right now, and all the way out to Falls Lake, and that's where it dumps its water, for lack of a better word, right? And the bad news is that because it comes from the city, it is pretty polluted. In fact, it's the most polluted creek that flows into Falls Lake.
Okay.
Why is that a problem? Well, Falls Lake is the drinking water for Raleigh, right? So we all want to be good stewards, not just of our own land and our own water, but also we want to be good neighbors. And so we all work together to try to figure out ways to improve the water quality so it's not so bad going into the lake. That's going to be a long-term project, but we're all kind of working together to try to make it happen. Glennstone is one example of where we're trying to improve the water quality through land conservation. So we've, the Glennstone neighborhood, when it was developed, part of the land was developed and part of it was donated to ECWA. And we are the stewards of that land now. It's about 80 acres. And we have opened it up for public use, so there's miles of trails now. You can come out to it, you can see it, you can use it, but also it's helping to filter the water before it goes to the creek. So instead of having a bunch more houses here, you've got a healthy ecosystem that, you know, filters water and hopefully improves the water quality downstream.
Yeah, and we spent a little time at the water treatment plant, so we know how important it is when the water is coming in, all the work that they have to do. So just making it a little easier for the water treatment plant is really important.
That's right.
Absolutely. We've also connected with folks that own land in riparian areas, which is like next to creeks and waterways, and how important it is to have that riparian buffer, that space next to the creek that insulates those creeks from either sediment loss or other pollutants entering the waterway.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, it's been cool connecting with so many different groups who are working towards this same goal of keeping our environment safe and healthy and protected for not only humans but also for our non-human neighbors and our human neighbors, like you said, in Raleigh and other places. Like, just we work together as an ecosystem and protecting these environments is just such a critical part of that.
That's right.
I'm so excited to learn more. Let's go check out some other parts of the preserve.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
So hi, how are you?
Good,
Can you tell us who you are and what you do here?
Yeah, so I'm Steve Anderson. I work with the Ellerbe Creek Watershed Association and also at Duke University in the River Center. Yeah, Lindsey?
Yes, I'm Lindsey Hu. I'm an undergraduate and I'm working for the Durham lab for over the summer, just helping out. So I'm actually a civil engineering student, but I'm really interested in like how the environment is impacted by human activities. So that I'm just helping out for the summer.
Wow, that's awesome.
That's great.
So yeah, what kind of research are you up to today?
Yeah, so Lindsey and I are out today because we're a part of this Bass Connections project, which is a program at Duke that does, gets undergraduates involved in all kinds of research work. But for us, it's with the Ellerbe Creek Watershed Association and in the watershed in Durham. So it's kind of a larger project that you could definitely check out online. But it's focusing on Durham specifically, and the river of our city being Ellerbe Creek. So we came out here today because we were down the road just a few minutes ago collecting. We have sensors in the water, so we measure water quality on a continuous basis for that project, but also kind of in collaboration with ECWA. And then we're coming here because we have a site just past the woods here in the creek, looking at how the different species of bugs that are emerging out of the water.
Cool.
Or maybe passing by and kind of looking at the diversity of bugs that are out here versus New Hope Creek, which is another watershed on the other side of Durham, which is a little more forested. It has kind of maintained more of a forest cover over time, whereas this is a little more of a, out here it's also like that, but in town it's more urban. So kind of comparing the urban versus more forested sections of the watershed.
That's
That's
super
really
cool.
exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also really cool to see the preserve used in this research context, right? Like we had just spoken with Ricky about all sorts of different reasons that this preserve exists. From offering kind of buffer for water, for protecting the environment against pollutants, all sorts of things. And then of course there's also understanding natural ecosystems and how even urban adjacent ecosystems, or in this case like urban ecosystems, function. That's really cool.
Yeah, and we're really in Ellerbe Creek being a great location for looking at how biodiversity and pollutants in the creek vary based on different kind of sub-watersheds in the watershed and how that relates to even human factors. So is that equitable? Is green space availability equitable? Is it, are there more pollutants in different portions of the watershed that, maybe we can do a better job, making sure that it's just across the board in our city. So that's a component I'm really excited about.
Yeah.
That's cool.
And that's part of our Bass Connections work and ECWA's work as well.
And I think that's really important for students to even think about, like, how can you affect this water on a continuous basis? And I don't feel like a lot of students connect to the water that they drink, which is why what we do right now is really important.
Yeah, and another component of what I'm working on with ECWA is a Creek Watchers program, which we want to get more students and more residents who are interested in kind of the water movement as a whole, or even green space and the preserves, getting people out to the creek, maybe taking samples, taking observations, more of a community science type project, which was kind of initially started based on what we've been hearing from community residents about flooding. So that's kind of a whole nother component of what preserves can do to help alleviate that, but also where is that happening and how can we help residents kind of connect with the city. So yeah, there's a lot happening.
Yeah.
No, that's so cool that we
great.
just happen to run into on the
Yeah.
trail and be able to talk about this. And I love that idea of you talking about how science is not just a tool for understanding the universe, but it's also a community of practitioners and of kind of people that share what they're learning. And it's really, really important for people to engage with that as a larger community, because as professional scientists, you can only be so many places at any given time, but there's people all over the place, and they can contribute to that
Yeah.
effort of understanding the world around them.
I mean, yeah, definitely. One thing that I learned about like working in this lab is just like there's so many things that can go wrong, and like you have to coordinate everyone at once, and it's a lot. But like it's always better to have like other people like working together and like be able to help each other out, because like it's so unpredictable out here.
Yeah.
Many hands make light work. Yeah. So Ricky, it looks like these trees were caught on fire.
Yeah, they did, intentionally,
Yeah.
believe it or not. Yeah, so we're starting a project where we do an ecological restoration of parts of the nature preserve. And that's important because a lot of these ecosystems in the Piedmont of North Carolina evolved with occasional fire. And since at least the past 150 years, we've had a lot of what's called fire suppression on the landscape. In other words, people don't want fire, right?
Right.
But that means that the ecosystem and the forest grew up into something different than what would have been here when there were fires. And we're trying to get it back to where it would have been, say, 200 to 400 years ago.
That's so cool. Yeah, we just visited Neville Handel down at the Mason Farm Biological Reserve with the North Carolina Botanical Garden, and yeah, he was explaining the same thing, that they're working on a similar kind of in a similar vein. They're in a similar direction. They're really trying to bring back that native ecological importance of fire, and how it's really important for a bunch of germination processes to happen. To I think we also learned a little bit about how longleaf pine in the sandhills is really affected by fire regime, and so it's really cool to see another group following that same wisdom, essentially. That
Yeah, and the cool thing is, even though Mason Farm is way on the other side of Durham and Chapel Hill, the geology is relatively similar. In other words, at Mason Farm and here, we're in a matrix. So in other words, we're surrounded by these soils that are highly acidic. So they're derived from geology that's really acidic. But then there's little pieces of the landscape that are on what's called diabase. And I think y'all might have learned about that at Mason Farm. And that diabase, as it erodes, creates a different type of soil that is both a different kind of consistency, and also it's less acidic. So instead of being really low pH, which means it's highly acidic, it's kind of a little higher pH. And what that means is different types of plants can compete better in those types of soils. And so what we'll find in the preserve as we go through it is some tree species, some plant species that are a little more rare around here than other species. And so this, as we restore it, as we add fire back into it, as we reduce the canopy cover of the trees and get more herbaceous, these types of kind of grasses and sedges and things in, we're going to hopefully see more diversity come in, and possibly even things from what we call the seed bank. because seeds in some of these areas that haven't been tilled recently, they can hang out in the soil for decades.
Wow.
And so it may be that we'll get some germination of things, some things popping up that we don't even know about.
I think that's
amazing.
really cool. And I think that's going to be really interesting to kind of watch how this land changes over time, because now you've just started the fire burning. So we can imagine how green this might all be in a couple years. It's going to be amazing.
Cool, Ricky, that was so cool seeing some of the Glennstone Nature Preserve. Just learning about this space, and especially how it's like so connected to, you know, Durham as a community. I mean, I'm looking at like houses right now, and it's like right here. That is just really cool. How can people get connected with the preserve and Ellerbe Creek Watershed Association to learn more?
The easiest way to start is really to just Google Ellerbe Creek Watershed Association. We're at ellerbecreek.org,
Cool.
and you can find out information about events that we have going on, about maps of all of our preserves. If you stop at any of our preserves at the kiosks, we have paper maps that you can pick up both in English and in Spanish. And you can learn about ways to volunteer through our website. We do stewardship work days where we go out and we pull up invasive plant species. We do a lot of community events. So just check out what we're doing when you're ready.
Absolutely. I got to join you all one night for a, we were looking at all these nocturnal insects. We got to see all these different moths and all these different other flying insects primarily, but other insects too that were just out and about, like right after dusk. That was a super fun event that you were leading.
One of my favorites. And we do a spring and a fall bioblitz every year.
Cool.
And the moth event is part of that. So that's another thing to kind of connect to. When this late summer, fall, we'll do another one of those, and in the spring we work with Museum of Life and Science and other partners to do a bigger kind of Durham-wide bioblitz.
Yeah, super cool. Well, thank you again, Ricky.
Of course.
Thank you so much for having us
Yeah,
today.
it was nice to meet y'all both.
Thank you. So if you'll stay tuned, we'll see you right afterwards for our question and answer session. Thank you.
See you in a minute. Stay tuned. Awesome. Thank you, friends, for watching. That was such a fun trip. It started raining. We were hoping to go out to the rookery, the heron rookery, but we didn't end up being able to make it out there. But still, Glennstone was amazingly beautiful that day, and it was so cool just running into Steve and Lindsey. And then that moth event I was talking about was actually Robert was leading that. It was great. So I would love to hear some of the questions that our campers had. If Stephanie, would you like to call out some of the cool questions that folks had?
Absolutely. Yeah, we've got lots of really great questions from our campers. One of the first ones we have is, why do people litter in the first place, especially at the creek?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it comes down to education about the creek. And education about where it's okay to put people's trash. I think by reaching out to folks and letting them know that littering in the creek is a bad thing, they will hopefully stop doing that when they find out how harmful it is to our local wildlife and to our local environment. Hopefully they'll stop doing it. I don't know why they do it in the first place, but I think teaching them why it's bad will prevent it from happening.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think sometimes people just don't know the consequences of their actions, right? They're just like, oh, well, this is easy for me. Out of sight, out of mind, right? And it takes kind of sometimes really getting into the creek or really going out to Falls Lake and seeing all the styrofoam piled up on the shores, or the other items, and then sometimes some pollutants are actually really hard to see or even understand their consequences. Like I remember learning a lot about the sediment contamination from the Eno River Association and from the county's water management district. One of the biggest issues for them is just dirt in the water. This is, and I think if you don't know that that's a problem, it can be really problematic. So I really love the education work that groups like ECWA and others are really doing to try and inform people that these are consequences that have negative impacts for a lot of, not just other species. I mean, even if you were just, caring about yourself, these are things that impact our community. Raleigh has to pay more money. Durham has to pay more money. Like, we are, living less healthy than we could if we were just not throwing that into the creek. Yeah. So I love that education is a really big part of your mission. So Stephanie, are there other cool questions?
Yeah, kind of connected to that question. Some of our campers were wondering why the creek is all dirty and what kinds of pollutants do you see? So kind of building off of what we were talking about, what kind of pollutants do you see in the creek, and that often kind of lead to Falls Lake as well?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why the creek is so dirty is that Ellerbe Creek is one of the most urban creeks in almost the entire state of North Carolina. It runs through almost directly from downtown Durham right to Falls Lake. And in doing so, that means that it runs through a lot of areas. They have a lot of roads. They have a lot of rooftops, a lot of sidewalks, a lot of places that people need to live and get around. The consequence of that being that every time it rains, the rainwater falls on these same places. We call them impervious surfaces, because when when rainwater falls on a street or a roof or anything like that, it isn't able to absorb into the ground. There's no grass, wooded areas for that water to absorb. So instead, it all just runs off into the stormwater system and then into Ellerbe Creek. So at any time that there's trash next to the stormwater system, next to a stormwater grate, anytime there's oil or the cars dripping oil and gasoline on the road, all of that pollution is going to end up in the creek. And so one of the things we try to do is implement what's called green stormwater infrastructure. These things that Ricky mentioned earlier in the video: rain gardens, rainwater harvesting cisterns, bioretentions, to try to prevent that water from becoming polluted runoff by stopping it before it gets to our roads and allowing it to infiltrate into the soil naturally, thus removing some of those pollutants and preventing that polluted runoff from reaching the creek. So there's a lot of work to do. It's very difficult to try and stop the volume of water. There's so many roads, so many roofs, so many sidewalks, that we have to do a lot of work. And even the work that we do, we still see some of these effects downstream. If you go all the way down to Falls Lake, every year, actually twice a year, we have to go out with canoes and pick up this trash from this massive island that forms in the creek, a massive trash island. From all the trash, I mean, we find, cups, bottles, basketballs, shopping carts, tires, that have all flowed all the way downstream. And we have to get volunteers. We remove, dozens to almost 100 bags of trash every time we have to go down there. So it's partially a problem of living just in a city with a lot of people in it. And that's why the creek continually needs our kind of tender loving care.
I love that, Robert. I think that's a really good way of looking at it, because I think a lot of things like those basketballs, like I remember one day it was like I used to live very close to the Ellerbe Creek, and I remember one time through Northgate Park, like it just was flooding immensely, and like I saw my neighbor's like trash can like getting carried away, and I was like, I mean, my neighbor obviously wasn't trying to litter their trash can, it just was being carried away. Like you mentioned, there's so many road surfaces and so much water flowing in our environment that a lot of it is just kind of, like you said, a consequence of being in a city. But just as there's a consequence of having all these things flow into the creek, there's also a lot of hands that can help in that restoration, in that tender loving care, as you put it. Cool, thank you. Stephanie, is there another cool question?
Yeah, so kind of thinking about how pollution, affects the ecosystem that is there. We have a lot of questions around what kind of animals live there, how many different types of snakes, if there are ever any eagles and things like that.
Cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the greatest parts about being able to work with the Ellerbe Creek is, on one level, we kind of deal with the pollution side of living in a city, right? And because there's so many roads and sidewalks and houses and buildings and things like that. On the other hand, the Ellerbe Creek gives us these kind of little pockets of natural gems that we can find inside the city. One of my favorite spots is the Beaver Marsh Nature Preserve, which is located over on Roxborough and East Club, kind of behind a big shopping center. And there's a big, I don't know if you've ever been over there, there's a big Compare Foods. It's actually very close to the museum itself. And we've absolutely seen bald eagles back there. We have beavers living in the lodge back there. We have pretty much all the species of snakes you can find in our natural area can be found right back there. All of our native snakes, and it's important to protect these natural areas because there's not a whole lot of them. But when you do find these little pockets, then wildlife exists there, and wildlife uses the creek as what's called a wildlife corridor. And a wildlife corridor is kind of connected pieces of land, typically where people don't live, that wildlife uses to kind of get around. So if wildlife is moving between, towards downtown Durham and Falls Lake, they'll use the Ellerbe Creek because a lot of that land is protected and we're trying to keep it protected. And so we've seen beavers, of course, river otters live in the creek. We've seen river otters down along that section of creek by the Beaver Marsh. Coyotes live back there. A lot of animals that you wouldn't think. Mink, if you've ever heard of a mink before, it's kind of a weasel-looking thing. They all exist along Ellerbe Creek because we've been able to protect some of these natural areas.
Yeah, I think that concept of how important the habitat and habitat connectivity of waterways like the Ellerbe Creek is so awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Robert. That was a cool question too. Thank you, Camper.
And also just the importance of sharing our environment too. Like it's not just us that are always here. Like we have all these cool wildlife animals that live kind of in these areas. So it's always important that we, share the habitat with them.
Yeah, so we also had some questions about the fires as well that they talked about. So how do they control the fires and how far out do the fires actually go?
Yeah, so the fires are very, very controlled. We want to make sure that the areas that we want burned, the areas that we think are going to benefit from this, what would have been a natural burn cycle, are the only areas that get burned. So we call it a controlled burn because we want to control it. And prior to when we're going to set things on fire, we go out there and we kind of dig out around the perimeter of the burn area. We kind of dig some ditches. We remove anything that's flammable, and we kind of create these buffer areas where we know the fire can't get across, because we don't want the fire to get out of control. And that's basically how we do it. We basically dig these kind of ditches all around where we want the fire to occur.
That's cool. Yeah, it's been cool meeting, like I mentioned in the video, multiple organizations that are really trying to bring back this kind of cycle that was present on our landscape, and we just thought we knew better as people. We were like, oh no, that's not good. But it's like, well, that was the evolutionary history of this ecosystem. This ecosystem needs this. So yeah, it was really cool to see another organization kind of working through those land management tools. I think we probably have time for one more question, Stephanie.
Yeah, so you mentioned that the creek starts in Durham, downtown Durham, abouts and flows into Falls Lake. Can you talk about how long the creek is in general, like how many miles it flows?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The short answer is I don't know. The long answer is it's pretty significant. The creek, as natural creeks are, for a while is kind of bendy. You know, a natural creek has what we call sinuosity, which means that it's almost snake-like, right? Makes a big S, and so part of the creek makes a big S, and then towards Falls Lake, the Army Corps of Engineers saw that big S curve that the creek was making and decided that the water wasn't leaving fast enough. And so they took our big S and they made it a straight line. And that kind of has had consequences for water quality in the creek since then. But so the creek isn't as long as it used to be. It used to be nice and meandering and just kind of lazily flowing through Durham. But part of the creek, it moves very fast, and so it's not as long as it used to be. As for actual miles, I don't know the answer to that. I can look it up for you and let you know.
That was great. Thank you so much, Robert. It was really, really cool to talk with you and connect with you. And also thank you for the videos that we used from some of your time in the Glennstone Nature Preserve.
Yeah, absolutely. That was very fun to go out there and enjoy wildlife. All those things, the herons, the snakes, the indigo buntings, they're all down there. They're in our little pockets of these natural areas right here in urban Durham. We just have to, be able to go out and find them.
So cool.
Awesome.
I'll let David carry away some more of the thanks.
Yeah, so I just want to give a special thanks to everyone that we saw in the video. So Ricky, Robert, Steve, Lindsey, and to everyone with the Ellerbe Creek Watershed Association. Y'all are awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I also want to give a special shout out to our DPS friends, so Willow Alston Soha and Dr. Linda Targaryen with Durham Public Schools for helping us put on Field Trip Fridays. And of course, one more shout out to Stephanie and all of our campers here at the Museum of Life and Science that are joining us today. So thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, David, for being a great host. Tanika is teaching this week at another camp, and so wasn't able to join us for this, but you'll see Tanika again soon. Next week, we will not be broadcasting, so we're actually going to take a little bit of a break. We hope you have an awesome 4th of July weekend this weekend. We'll be back on the 16th of July, and we'll be visiting Earth Moves, which is an exhibit here at the Museum of Life and Science, where we can investigate the Earth's surface. So we'll get to see various rock types, and we'll explore how various surface processes like erosion move rocks large and small from mountains to sea in our state. So a lot of sediment makes a really long journey across our entire continent in some places, but particularly here in North Carolina, we see a lot of sediment movement from the western part of the state to the eastern beaches, and we're going to explore some of the ways that happens in Earth Moves at the Museum of Life and Science next week. So thank you again, everyone, for all your curiosity, and keep your minds open, keep your eyes open, your ears listening, and I hope you have a great week. We'll see you next time. Bye, friends.